Good morning, everybody. Welcome to TRLab's special presentation of Art and Pride, or Pride and Art, however you want to look at it. I think that we'll discover both of these today are very important in art history, but also in our culture today. And I'm joined here with a special guest. Some of you may have met before in previous AMAs, but Layne Gao is here. Good morning, Layne.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. And would you mind introducing yourself a little bit for our crowd today?
Yeah, sure. I'm a member of TRLab and I joined almost a year now. And I mainly take part in the business development and PR for TRLab. And before joining TRLab, I came from a traditional art background. So I've worked with auction house, gallery, and nonprofit art organizations. So I've always been an enthusiast in the art world. Yeah, and it's a great honor and pleasure to be here today and share with our community my knowledge of art. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and that's a huge reason. That's why I wanted you here because you are very knowledgeable and very passionate about art, and I really enjoyed talking with you. The little bit that we've gotten to know each other since I started working for TRLab. So welcome. And the focus today is on International Pride Day, which is June
Mhm.
28th every year. And this is a day that commemorates actually the anniversary of a pretty big event here in New York City back in 1969. June 28th, 1969 was a day where a lot of LGBT, QIA plus, there's an acronym that describes, I think, everybody in the spectrum, or what we maybe nowadays just label as queer. There was a gathering happening at a bar here in New York, and police were sent to crack them down. And it was actually a lot of black women of color, and I would say trans women of color, who actually
Mhm.
stood up to the police and said, no, this is not going to happen. And I think what we have now known as the Stonewall Uprising, this is a picture actually of the outside of the Stonewall Inn. And, this is a group that friends that look just like all of our friends, right? This is nothing that was out of the norm, but, after many years and a long history of oppression, I think that people really decided enough was enough, and they were going to stand up. And here is actually Stonewall today. This is a picture I actually took back in 2019 for the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, and you can see that the inn itself is still alive and well, and in fact it's a very popular destination here in New York, and just last week was actually designated as a National Historic Park here in the US. So they'll be building an actual visitor center outside of the Stonewall Inn, so that anyone that comes to visit has the opportunity to see this historic place.
Mhm.
And you see all those flags there, and I just wanted to throw out there real quick. There's so many different flags, but we've really seen everything kind of come together recently in the past couple of years here in the US. And I think it's kind of led the worldwide scene of pride, where you have all these various different flags that mean a lot of different things. Everybody can choose their own way to show their own pride, right? But now it's come together, I think, in what we're calling this updated pride flag. You might see it around, and this kind of gives you an idea, right, of what these colors mean. If you're ever seeing this flag out there, you see the normal rainbow colors that we're all associated with. we're all familiar with, rather. And you can see the colors here are associated with various meanings, like red equals life, orange is healing, yellow is new ideas, green is prosperity, blue for serenity, and violet for spirit. But now, I think in order to just really be inclusive and acknowledge, again, the Black trans voices that really led to the beginning of the Pride movements, and kind of the claiming of these historical rights for people, we've now really made an effort to include these Black and brown stripes, as well as the white, blue, and pink, which really represent the trans community. So, yeah, that's the basic idea of the pride flag. And Layne, I just wanted to um, start there, just because I feel like a lot of people see the rainbow flag and they don't really know the symbolism. And I think symbolism is something that's really important in our culture, and obviously in art. And this is where we have the opportunity now, as um, professionals in the art industry, to help collectors who are looking at art help understand more about these artists' lives, more about the work they were doing and why. And this is a huge reason why I wanted you to join this talk, because we've been talking in TRLab over the past couple of weeks across our social channels about modern art, and just trying to help bring some extra education and exposure to our community, so that right now during the summer, while we're gearing up for our next big project, this is a new opportunity for people to learn a little bit more, and become more acquainted with some really fantastic periods of art. The end of the modern era, as I understand it, kind of coincides with this 1969 period, where a lot of queer artists, LGBT artists, were active and doing really amazing things. So, I felt it was really appropriate to kind of look at this, and there was a huge focus in New York too, and I think we'll get to that. So it really just seemed appropriate to start there with Stonewall, kind of explain what International Day of Pride is about. And now I'd really love to start talking about some of these major queer artists of modern art.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, have you personally known any artists that identify as queer or as LGBTQIA plus, some part of this acronym? And why do you think it's really important that they choose to identify in that way?
Yeah, I completely agree with all you have just said, and I think you give us a really nice introduction on the background information of this movement and the cultural, just the cultural background for us. And I can think of several artists, and some of them are quite famous because of their identity, and some of them are less famous. But I would like to go into the slides and introduce a little bit about the artists that I can think of.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, so we might know that the queer art movement and all the revolution on sexuality in art started in the later half of last century, but actually I think it started quite early, and it has been queer art and artists in art history all the time. But for example, I think Claude Cohan was one of the most important artists that we relate with this movement, and also some of the artists that people might have heard of before, but not knowing that they're queer artists, especially like Francis Bacon and Saint Twombly. And I think when we talk about queer art, we can't forget Andy Warhol, who was really proud of his identity. And as you mentioned that you think the end of modern art was basically probably happened take place at the same time when when the cultural is taking bigger revolutions on human rights and cultural changes. And I think he is definitely one of the greatest figures that we should include in this discussion. And there are also artists who came after him, for example, Davey Hockney, who is a British artist, but also lived in Los Angeles, giving us another location to this group of artists. And also Robert Mapplethorpe, Keith Herron, and Basquiat. Some of them may fall into the period of contemporary art, but I think when we talk about this movement, in general, we cannot like separate them from separate one from each other. Yeah. Right. So back to the point that you mentioned, why we think this is important. I personally believe that art is one of the ways that we look at history, one way that we look at culture. And I think some of the artist works have been neglected because of some repression in the social laws, or just prejudice. But I think bringing them back to light is one important way for us to rediscover, research, and also reinterpret their works with a different perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's a really good point, because I think I'm sure I take it for granted, and I'm sure many people in the US here take it for granted, that some of these names we recognize and we see in other museums or whatnot, or displayed on t-shirts or posters. But here in the US, we have incredible freedom, and especially when it comes to LGBT rights, most of the world does not actually have the level of rights and visibility that LGBT have here in the US. And that's really unfortunate, and it's very easy for us to take that for granted. So I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because I think it's even more important for us to really acknowledge these artists and the impact that they've had. um, and not everybody is guaranteed to know about them, as famous as we might think that as they are. um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
exactly.
yeah, so I guess I'd be curious, how easily can you identify a queer modern artist? Are there any specific styles or influences that you see associated with this group?
Yeah, I think for if generally speaking, I don't think queer art movement specifically tied to one kind of artistic creation. It applies to basically everything from painting to photography. But if we look more closely with, for example, the artists that we mentioned here about, we can actually see a change in their ways of expression over the time. For example, so here is a painting by Francis Bacon, who is a very important British figure artist, and people were mostly attracted by his figurative and raw and unsettling imagery. And this one Pope, the painting, which was made around 1958, was very important. And some of the works from this series were also presented at auctions and fetched really high prices. So they're not only important because of their high records, but also because the intrinsic value that the artists represent. So he is also one of the earliest artists that we identify as queer artists in modern art. period. And for example, in this painting, we can probably see some explicit expression of homosexuality, which was probably it was actually not, cannot be represented explicitly when the painting was made. And the interesting story is that when the gallery owner bought this painting in 1953, he had she has to hand it in an upper room just to deter scrutiny from police,
Sure.
because who might have complained that the graphic subject matter was obscene. Yeah. But we can still see some like very explicit traits that Bacon has expressed with his identity.
Yeah.
But for example, like, yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, you're just, I really love this, and you're absolutely right. I think a lot at this time in the 50s in America, there actually was a growing movement of homophobia,
Mhm.
anti-LGBT following the First World War, and uh, you know, uh, obviously there was artists like Gertrude Stein and some other really famous writers, musicians, poets, etc., who were doing work during this time. But something like this, even though it's not even that explicit or that graphic, still had to be hidden. It had to be
Yeah,
censored. We weren't allowed to show it. And for me, that always kind of makes me think of like, um, our our skin color is one thing, right? We show it to the world, and sometimes our faith or other aspects that sometimes are discriminated against,
yeah,
it's very hard to hide those, right? You're a woman, I'm a man, you're going to have a much harder time in a lot of cultures, right? Or periods of history, just by that nature. But sexuality, or how we identify as ourselves, that's so internal and so personal, that it's already a hidden thing. So if we want to express it at all, um, we take giant risks sometimes, or we feel really scared. So um, I'm
it's
glad that
it,
Francis
it,
Bacon created
yeah,
this. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. No, I completely agree, and I think that's also one of the reason why some artists, even our historians nowadays, discovered that their sexual identity is questionable, but they kind of like hid it at the time when they make creations, because
Mm,
it's kind of like forbidden to say. And yeah, for example, like Cy Twombly, um,
great.
I believe he's also an artist in question because he never explicitly demonstrate his sexuality, and he actually married for a very long time. But when people revisited his works, and like when early modern artists, when they for example, when they're queer artists, they never represent those in their paintings, but they record, we can find in their letters, in their photographs who they sent to their intimate partners. That's how we found out who they really are. But we cannot blame them because it was just a social structure. Yeah. But as there are more and more activists, in no matter Europe or the United States or other countries, people are beginning to be more and more frank in their creations in terms of like subject matters. For example, here are the two artists that I think are great, important figures in this queer art movement. The first one is Claude Cohan, who is a French female artist that probably the earliest one that we're going to talk about today. And what she did was, um, her works is really expressive, and some of them are playful and subversive. So she always plays with gender identities. Um, and I think she was trying to um, explicitly demonstrate that she was a lesbian, and she also changed their. I should probably use the name there. They
Sure,
actually
yeah,
changed their name from Lucy Schnapp to another to a different name. So it's like a alter ego, and so they like shaved her head, everything that um, she tried. Like I kept using the wrong word, but just they tried to identify themselves. And one thing that's very interesting is that um, the artist never disclosed, these works when they were alive. So a lot
mm,
of the very important photographs were rediscovered after the 80s when people, became more aware of this um, group of people, group of artists in this culture. Yeah. And also Mapplethorpe, it was very important too, but he actually came later than Claude. um, he's also a very famous photographer, and I think one important thing about his work is that he altered perceptions and pushed boundaries in relation to the male gaze upon the male body. So historically speaking, that we always talk about how male artists look at female bodies and look them as objects. But in Mapplethorpe's photographs, he actually turned the subject matter to males. And he also encountered difficulties representing his works when he was alive. One of his exhibitions, maybe more of his exhibitions, were um, banned because of the the scenes that they represent. But
sure.
still, he was still very resistant in identifying who he really is. Yeah.
Yeah, and Mapplethorpe, is a really classic example of somebody who could capture these amazing figures, and I think also really tried to incorporate a lot of men of color in his works. But he
Hmm.
also had some very explicit works, right? And explored, a lot of different subject matters. So I'm not surprised at all to hear that some of them were not shown.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. That's a great point.
yeah. So um, I guess I'm curious. Had you known Claude Cohan very much prior to me asking you about this?
Hmm. Sorry.
Were you
Could you?
familiar with Claude Cahoon's works very, very, very much prior to me asking you to join this talk?
I studied her works in my art history courses, but I knew that she was very important in art history,
Yeah,
very avant-garde. But yeah, and looking back at his work, at her works this time for our discussion today, I was still really intrigued and just fascinated by what she was doing at the time. Yeah.
that's great. Yeah, and this is actually some of the when you had brought her up, this was some of the first time that I had really had the chance to really delve in and research their work. So thank you for exposing me to new artists.
Oh,
Um,
that's great. It's good to
yeah,
hear.
yeah. But I also found in a lot of my research, and my background is in music, and I've always been very interested in researching queer composers and musicians, like John Cage and
Mm,
uh, Virgil Thompson, Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein, some of America's most famous composers. Um, and writers too. I used to work with a lot of authors, so I've kind of gathered that there's this huge connection between New York City and Paris. Do you have an understanding of why this might be?
I think. Paris became the center of the art world since the beginning of modern art. I guess since 1850s or even earlier. So especially like the most of the modern art movements that we talk about, Impressionism, Surrealism, they all started in Paris or somewhere near Paris in Europe. And then New York came into the active art scene. I think more after the world wars. So it's like the transition between the two art centers, and they definitely are embrace more diverse cultures. So I think that's how, and especially because like most of the artists and poets and writers lived in the two cities, and people have been moving back and forth, especially during the wartime. So that's also one reason why there's cultural communication exchanges between the two cities, I think.
That's super interesting, and that makes total sense. Um, and I know you had mentioned some of these other artists were from other places. Do you see other, geographical locations and art history that are really resonating with queer artists at this time?
At this time, I would probably say Paris and New York were the most, central locations for queer artists.
Yeah.
And I also have here several works from this artist here. So for this one is Claude Cohan's another work by Claude Cohan, and also Thorpe. Besides his photographs of nude male, he's also a great expert on flowers. I personally love his flowers
That's
very
amazing.
much. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
another work by him. Yeah, but he was very active in New York
Yeah.
during the 20th century. Yeah, and I think before we move to another location, there's another artist that I really want to talk about from New York, who is Keith Herron, and he is, I think, probably the first graffiti artist that bring subculture of the 1980s into people's, you know, into the public, um, yeah, just into the public. And I think much of his works includes sexual allusions that turn into social activism by using
Mm,
the images to advocate for safe sex and AIDS awareness.
right.
Well, he himself died from AIDS, I think, in 1990. Yeah, but he actually founded his foundation to support, you know, subculture and um, children who have AIDS, which is very philanthropic act at the time. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, this is one of his public works. He did that a lot when he was alive, and we call some of his work the subway paintings because he
Yeah.
painted a lot of them in the subway station. So make art more, just closer to people's life.
Absolutely.
Here's an artist that just, and going back to your question, that I want to bring to your attention, Davey Hockney, who is a British artist, but he actually lived in LA, I think Santa Monica and Malibu, if I'm not wrong, for a very long time. And he was also really explicit about his identity, really brave at the time because he came into prominence, I think, before um, the social rights activities. Yeah, and so for example, this painting, I actually was really lucky to see this painting in person when I was working at Christie's.
Wow.
and people have, a lot of interpretations on the two figures, and some of them think that this is himself, some of them think that this is him with his muse or partner. And just without seeing who this person in the swimming pool really is, just leave us a lot of more intrigues for people to interpret. Yeah. So I guess, well, Los Angeles is also a metropolitan city, and I think big cities definitely have more space for more diverse cultures,
Right.
generally speaking. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
especially, I think the art scene in the West Coast became more and more active after World War II, or maybe in 50s and 60s. So that's also one of the location that we might take into discussion when we talk about queer artists. Yes. So this is also a painting by Davey Hockney, and this one is the male that he's depicting is his muse. And I think they were on a vacation somewhere, and he just depicts this very beautiful and calming scene with his vibrant colors. It's really beautiful one.
And I feel like these colors to me really like just say like West Coast, like this
Yeah.
kind of color palette. It like and I it's very interesting. I guess I never really realized that before, but it does strike me that way.
Exactly. Yeah, it does look really West Coast. It's
Hmm.
really vibrant. Yeah,
Yeah,
and with sunshine.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that one thing that that makes me think of is, first of all, I guess are there ways that you see these works of art? And here I'll go back to the Hockney here. I mean, you said he's on vacation here, but do you see that there's any general themes explored in these works, or like particular subjects, or how they represent the society of the time? I feel like this is always something I'm thinking about, is how does a musician or an artist, through their works, they're just inherently expressing the life around them and how it influences them. Do you see this anything popping up with these artists or this era?
Yeah. I think it started more with intimate themes,
Mhm.
such as self portraits and portraits of close ones, as we have seen in Hockney's painting and also in Claude's self portraits. Um, I think that's also, I think it makes sense to me because having self portrait is, making self portraits is one way to represent or to show your identity. And, queer artists and the sexuality that they focus on usually take place between themselves and their intimate partners. So I think that's also one scene, one general theme that they really look into. Yeah. And as I mentioned, that I don't think queer art adhere to any particular style. But just going back to your question, in terms of the themes that I think people concerned more with themselves and with people around them. Yeah.
That's a good point, and this is obviously the means of a self-expression,
Yeah.
and kind of what I was getting to earlier, with these times, even in the 70s, just because Stonewall had happened, the Stonewall Uprising happened in 1969, doesn't mean that all the problems were solved, right? And
Yeah.
you know the artistic expression is still probably going to be the best way for an artist to really demonstrate who they are. And I can think of a number of artists. I'm thinking of a manga artist from Japan, Sadao Hasagawa, who
Mm.
was very well known for his ink drawings in magazines, but he had this whole other subculture, maybe more in the style of Robert Mapplethorpe, exploring these identities of his own sexuality, as well as faith and religion. A lot of Shinto and Buddhist type things coming through in his works. So I'm not surprising at all. It's not surprising at all to hear you say that it's kind of this intimate expression that really carries through in their works.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually reminds me of what Cy Twombly and Francis Bacon created in their works, that they were fascinated about myths and,
Mm.
just some religious topics too. But I think art for artists has always been a way to find themselves. um yeah, so maybe not only in their self-expression, like self-portraits or images of them with close ones, but also in more higher level of um just spiritual, just spiritual content that they were looking for, and they represent in their works too.
Yeah, and that's not surprising either. I feel like so often, our gender is one thing, but our sexuality is a whole other thing, and quite often it's the sexuality, I feel like, that comes under scrutiny by various religions or philosophies. So
Mhm.
for an artist to be able to grapple with that, it makes total sense that that's going to be a huge component of their work. And that itself is a very interesting topic, maybe to
Yeah,
explore in a future
yeah.
conversation. But you know um I kind of, along those lines, I feel like there is a lot of uh, uh distinct cultural biases as well. And I find, while the Stonewall riots and uprising were led by these queer people of color, these trans women of color, um, Black and Latina people here in New York, it's very difficult to find artists from this time period who aren't white men, right?
Mhm.
And I tried very hard to find an example of someone from Asian descent. And the best I could find personally was um, the famous sculptor Noguchi. Um, he himself was not queer, but his dad was, apparently, and he was an author. And only through his writings and kind of posthumously after he
Mm.
died do we kind of know more about his life. But it also struck me that in the Black or African American um, population, there is also a really large stigma against homosexuality or queerness. And I think as a result, we don't see as much expression within that society during certain periods of time. But I was thinking here in New York, a little bit before all this time period, maybe around the area of Claude Cohan, the 1920s, 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance was really booming here in New York. And I'm just curious if you know of any notable Black artists that we would now recognize as queer, and do you have any other thoughts as to why we just don't see as many in art history?
Yeah, I think the most notable queer artist of color that I can think of might be Jean-Michel Basquiat.
Mm,
Um, but he actually came, well, he was born in, I forgot, I think, 90, 60.
Yeah,
But that's
right.
still
Yeah,
like much later than what you just mentioned, the Harlem Renaissance. Well, his works was really really important, as he talked about dichotomies such as wealth versus poverty, integration versus segregation, etc. And he also explicitly identified himself as a queer artist. But I think the lack of artists of color that we can think of that fall into this group is also related to the social changes. Nowadays, we've been looking a lot at um, artists of minorities, of their artworks, but back, even if just like 50 or 60 years back, earlier, they were not that recognizable,
sure.
from, even not only publicly but also from academic or historical point of view. Yeah. So that's, I think that's the main reason why there are very few queer artists of color that we can think of. But um, Basquiat is very important, and I really love his works. Yes, well,
That's
his
great.
works, and he really died. He died really young, and it was very unfortunate. But his works just reminds me of some young boy who's never lost, um, a very pure heart. Yeah, with a lot of the cartoonish visuals. Yeah, it's really cute.
Wow. Wow, and that's incredible. Like this one right here makes me just immediately think of just last week at NFT NYC,
Mm,
going to the Medici Gallery exhibition and seeing some really huge X copies, and this kind of
yeah,
the colors and the way that Basquiat here is using this 2D flat image to just make it seem like this vibrant, popping thing. You know, that's actually pretty amazing. I had never thought about
yeah,
that.
I
Wow.
know. Actually, when I first saw X Copy's works, I immediately thought of Basquiat too. But
Wow.
in
Okay.
Basquiat paintings, even though it's more a traditional medium, well, X Copy put that into a digital medium, and I think that's great too. I personally love the artist a lot too. But Basquiat, well, whenever I see his works, I can think of something broken, but something, still like very like unbreakable at the same time in his works. Yeah, just the broken visuals and the emotions.
Wow. Very, yeah,
Yeah.
very well said. Uh, do you find, I guess, throughout these groups of artists that we've been talking about, that there's any particular innovations or in the style or techniques that they're using that have really emerged and become known today?
Yeah, I think we cannot really forget Andy Warhol, one of the most important
Mm,
artists in the 20th century art. And he was also a queer artist, but he just took like so many innovations, ways of creating art, and no matter in the subject matter or just the way of creating art itself. For example, well, this, but yeah, I found this portrait of Basquiat and
whoa.
Andy Warhol. Yeah, they were close friends. I think why, as you mentioned before, like why New York has become one of the major scenes that we talk about in queer art movement was that a lot of artists at the time were friends with each other, and that they really created a circle that encouraged them to create and to identify who they are. So this mutual understanding also, I think that contributes a lot to what we're seeing in the queer art scene today. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm sure that people are really familiar with Warhol's Monroe silkscreen paintings, and he was the person that really bring pop art into serious art making, and he celebrated advertising, celebrity culture, and also his work spanned a variety of media, including painting, silk screening, photography, film, and sculpture. Yeah, so I think one of the ideas that he advocates at the time was mass production to make art more accessible for the public, for everyone, which
Mm.
is also, I think, one of the important characteristic of contemporary art too. Yeah. So there are several works that I chose from Warhol's um, body of works that I think can identify him as a queer artist too. For example, this one is also of the male body, and Warhol also explicitly demonstrate that his sexuality. Um, for example, this works in this one, he dressed himself as a female, much as well. I think Claude did that earlier, but when Warhol did this, he was brave enough, or the society allows him to, just present this work in front of people's eyes, which is very different from, decades ago. Yeah. So
Yes.
that's how we can see the change in the societal, um, prejudices too.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, right? It took these other artists like Claude Cohan and these earlier artists to really pave the way for other artists to make even just a little bit more of a statement to another probably small niche crowd, so that decades later Basquiat or Keith Haring could do their thing. and
Yeah.
and and nowadays, I think, speaking of drag, looking at this photo right here, RuPaul's Drag Race, right? It's a worldwide phenomenon. I think it's appealing to people of whatever sexuality, gender, race, age, whatever, and it's become an art form in itself, right? This idea
Mhm.
of expressing yourself in in um, in another form, whatever it might be. And I think that's also a really interesting point, which I hadn't thought about, was just contemporary art as it's coming through and progressing. It does start to become just more inclusive, and I guess all encompassing of all these different styles and expressions. Uh, it's
Exactly. Yeah.
super interesting.
Yeah.
And it's interesting,
And
the one you showed before this, sorry, it was when I first saw those two images side by side, I didn't immediately think this was a man, because I feel like the way that he's played with this form and figure and the colors, in my mind, just immediately made me think, oh, this is a woman, crouching
yeah,
forward, right? So
yeah, it's a typical female form that we usually think of, but I think
mm,
that's also a tricky part of this work too. And thanks so much for mentioning that, Ryan. Yeah, I think that's a great way of just looking at this work too.
yeah, yeah. Um, so I'm curious then, looking at all these artists from kind of this modern era and this cusp leading into the contemporary art period, um, I guess are you seeing a lot of these artists now influencing other, visual artists here, let's say drag aside? Um, are you seeing a lot of influence, and do you have any particular artists that come to mind for people to check out who are watching today?
Yeah, I guess I guess we can say that maybe all of the artists, like young contemporary artists, are influenced by these pioneers. Um, came earlier than they are, um, and I think our histories are constantly being evaluated with new findings, new readings. So we have to like keep challenging past conventions, and also new findings and new ways of interpreting these artists' works can also reshape how we understand art history, and to dig out the silence in the artworks. So yeah, I think if we want to talk about how many artists these masters have influenced, we can definitely talk about that for hours.
Yeah,
But I would say they really um, were really brave in representing themselves, and that just influenced everyone, and not only the artists but also the viewers, like me, like you, and our community members who are interested in art in many ways. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it means so much to see someone express themselves in a way that then inspires you or resonates with you, and you can identify part of yourself within that work, whether it's you identifying um your, again, like your faith or some part of your culture, or some part of this like more deeper hidden part of who you are as a being, and um, being able to feel that resonate with yourself is so powerful. And um, now you say that, like, that's definitely inspired me, whether it's visual art or like I guess I'm thinking of was it Felix Gonzalez Torres?
Oh, I
Or
love Gonzalez Taurus.
yeah, I think the first work I ever encountered of his was at the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and
Hmm.
it was gosh, I forget the name of the work, but you probably know it. It's this giant pile of candy in a
Yeah,
corner, right?
the weight
And
of one of his friends.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
and you're invited to actually. It's fun because you're actually invited to take a piece of candy and bring back that piece of his friends, his love, whatever it might be, and bring it with you and enjoy it and bring it into yourself, kind of become one with it. And it's a fun, playful work, and it's also inclusive, right? Just like you
Yeah.
were talking about. um so that just then makes me want to share art with other people, or work with artists who want to share their art with other people, and meet folks like yourself for the rest of the people on the TRLab team. So I'm really happy for that part. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah,
Same. Yeah. And also Gonzalez Torres was also a queer artist too.
yeah, yeah.
His
For
works are
sure.
really touching. Yeah.
Yeah,
He,
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
one of his works, The Perfect Lovers. So he made two clocks. And I think one of them was at MoMA. I think it's still at MoMA. Yeah. On exhibition, at least the last time I went to MoMA.
That's a,
But
yeah,
yeah, because he was talking about himself and his partner, and it's like two simultaneous clocks. Yeah, it was a beautiful work.
that's great. That's
Yeah,
great. Well, sorry, go ahead. I
it's
interrupted.
really great sharing with you and discussing with you on these topics. And you mentioned a lot on the music component, and I think maybe next time we can also start a conversation on that too, because
Yeah.
it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I was talking to Bing Dai, Everybody I think watching this video is very familiar with Bing in the Discord. She's just such a amazing person and so knowledgeable about art, and especially she and I have this shared background and interest in music. And she shared with me actually a composer by the name of Singer. And I'm it's bad, but I already forgot her first name. But she was kind of the heiress to the Singer sewing machine fortune. But she did a lot to not only write music, but also just support artists in general. And I think again that's so important for this group of artists, of queer artists. Whatever you're doing, whether you're an author writing books or poetry or music or art, the fact that you can lend your voice to support other artists is really, really important. And I absolutely would love to do a music segment in the future. So thank you,
Yeah,
Layne, for bringing that up.
I look forward to that very much. Yeah.
All right. Well, great. We're coming up on the time. Very perfectly timed here. And I just want to say again, thank you so much, Layne, for joining us and sharing your knowledge and passion with us. And I'm really looking forward to having you back for another talk.
Thank you. I would love to. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And it's so enjoyable just talking with you on art and sharing with more people. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so
All
much,
right, well,
Ryan.
yeah, thank you. And everybody watching, happy Pride Day, happy Pride Month as we come to a close. And as always, you can join us in the TRLab Discord for more of these discussions in the future. And by the way, if you didn't already, drop your wallet address in the Pride and Art TRCab channel, and we'll make sure that you can claim a TRCab for watching this talk. Thank you very much for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you may be, and we'll talk to you soon.
Happy Friday. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.